All right, let's dive into something that, well, probably feels pretty familiar to a lot of us. We're going to talk about that strange gap between who we are online and who shows up in real life. You know, our unseen digital self. So picture this. You swipe right, the profile looks amazing. The conversation is great, you feel a real connection, and you decide to meet up. But then you get there, and the person in front of you looks, well, different. Not a totally different human, but just not quite what you were expecting. It's a weirdly common story in dating today.
And it turns out, this isn't just something you and your friends talk about. This exact feeling, that little letdown from a filtered first date, was actually the focus of a pretty detailed academic study. Researchers wanted to figure out the psychological fallout when our digital dreams meet a slightly different offline reality. So let's start right there, at that first date. What actually happens when there's a mismatch between the profile and the person? What did the research find? Okay, so this Walden University study wasn't a giant survey. It was deep and personal. Researchers sat down for detailed interviews with 8 heterosexual guys who were all experienced Tinder users. We're talking at least 2 years on the app. The whole point was to really hear their stories about meeting women whose real-life appearance just didn't quite match up with their super-filtered profile pictures.
Now, to really understand that feeling of disappointment they described, we need to talk about a concept from psychology. It's called expectation disconfirmation theory. It sounds complicated, but the idea is actually super simple. Our satisfaction with anything is basically decided by the gap between what we thought was going to happen and what actually happens.
And here's how that plays out. On the left, you've got these high expectations built from a perfectly curated, filtered profile. On the right, you have the reality of the first date. When that gap is big, you get what's called negative disconfirmation. That leads to lower satisfaction, a weaker first impression. The whole thing just gets off to a rocky start. So the issue isn't just about how someone looks. It's about the psychological gut punch of a broken expectation.
So, okay, that explains what happens in that moment of disappointment, but it doesn't really get to the why. I mean, why do we feel so much pressure to put this idealized version of ourselves online to begin with?
Well, the study points to a classic idea from sociology, Goffman's theory of self-presentation. The basic idea is that all the world is a stage. We're always performing for an audience, trying to manage the impression we make, whether that's in a job interview or, on a first date.
Now, you can imagine, in the world of dating apps, that stage is just massively crowded. The competition, the social pressure, it's huge. So our performance gets cranked up to 11. We're not just presenting our true selves. A lot of the time, we're presenting our ideal self. You know, the one we think will stand out, seem impressive, and get that all-important validation of a match or a like.
But here's the thing. This constant performance, this pressure to live up to some perfect digital version of you, it's not free. There's a real, well-documented psychological cost. And that brings us to our next piece of the puzzle.
A major study in Frontiers in Psychology looked at over 1,000 college students and found a super clear link. The more problematic their social media use, the higher their social anxiety. But here's what's fascinating. It wasn't a direct line. The researchers found there's a crucial middle step that explains how one actually leads to the other.
So here's the chain reaction they discovered. It starts with what they call problematic usage, just spending way too much time online. That often pushes out real, face-to-face connection, which then leads to more loneliness. And it's that feeling of being lonely that really fuels the fire, reinforcing all those negative beliefs we might have about ourselves. That right there is the engine of social anxiety.
And they were actually able to put a number on it. Loneliness accounted for 18.5% of the total effect, connecting problematic social media use to social anxiety. So the takeaway is huge. It's not just about screen time. It's the loneliness that the screen time can create that's doing the real damage. Okay, so we've seen how crafting that perfect profile can totally backfire, and how being too online can lead straight to anxiety, which brings up this really fascinating, kind of counterintuitive question. What about the people who just opt out of the whole performance?
And this is the last stop on our little investigation. Let's talk about the psychology of people who choose to stay digitally invisible. Because honestly, their choice tells us a lot about a totally different way of thinking about self-worth. Psychologists point out that people who don't post a lot often have some key strengths. They tend to prioritize their own privacy and their mental peace over getting a bunch of attention. They usually have a really strong sense of who they are, one that doesn't need an audience to feel real. This emotional security means they don't need likes to feel good. And they're also just very aware that social media is often, an illusion.
One analysis I saw put it perfectly with this quote. It's not that these people are hiding, it's just that they don't feel like they have anything to prove. Their sense of self is already whole, with or without an online audience.
So let's bring it all home. We've seen the disappointment of the filtered date. We've looked at the pressure to perform, the anxiety that can follow, and the quiet strength of people who just opt out. What does this all tell us when we put it together?
The whole thing really boils down to this one core conflict. On one side, you have the search for external validation from the digital world. Likes, matches, shares, which can easily trap you in that cycle of performance and anxiety. And on the other side, you have the hard work of building internal security, a sense of self that's solid and doesn't change based on online feedback.
So the most important point is this. This isn't about online being bad and offline being good. It's not that simple. The real key here is just awareness. It's about understanding why you're creating the digital self that you are and what you're really looking for from it.
Which leaves us with one last question to really think about. When you look at your own profiles, your own digital habits, is the person you've created online actually helping the person you are offline, or is it costing you more than you realize?